My name is Dr. Fernando Castillo, and for 17 years I worked for the National Parks Administration here in Argentina. I was posted all over the country, but most of my time was spent in a place known as Gran Chaco. El Gran Chaco, or the Chaco Plains, as you might call them in English, is an area of semi-arid lowlands spanning several countries here in South America. It's a mix of savannas and thorn scrub, but also subtropical forests, palm groves, and wetlands, and is home to thousands of unique and rare species of plants and animals. It is an incredibly beautiful place, but since the 1970s, the region has been plagued by illegal logging and forest fires set by cattle ranchers who want more area for their cattle to graze. In my final year of employment, Gran Chaco lost tens of thousands of hectares of forest, and I've seen the heartbreaking effects of men's greed with my own two eyes. But I've also seen far, far worse things in the forests of Gran Chaco. And of all of them, this is the one that haunts me the most. During the late summer of 1991, I was out doing some survey work around 20 miles north of a little town called Fuerte Esperanza. After crossing a long and desolate patch of flat scrubland, I reached a section of forest composed of algarrobo and pink trumpet trees. The algarrobo are particularly favorites of illegal loggers, so I wanted to make sure that this forest was untouched by their hands. Now, I spent around an hour walking around, making notes and marking the area on my map, and then once I was happy that the forest was in good condition, I started making my way back towards where I'd left my ATV. Gran Chaco is a very wild place, meaning many of the forests do not have any well-defined trails or paths to walk on. Even if they did, the nature of my work means I have to walk places that are infrequently traveled, so sometimes I lose my footing among the many roots and fallen branches. And this trip was no different. Most of the time I merely stumble when catching my foot on something, but on this occasion, I caught my foot immediately after hopping over a thick branch which had fallen among some knee-high grass. I was totally unprepared for the second impediment and completely off my balance, so after my foot caught on, I was sent tumbling into the grass in front of me with a very loud crunch. Notice how I described it as a crunch and not a thud, because I didn't fall directly into the dirt and grass. Something broke my fall, something hard but kind of brittle. I didn't check to see what it was at first because my priority was to inspect the fresh grazes on my forearms and elbows. But then after picking myself up, I saw that I hadn't landed on a pile of fallen branches. I'd landed almost directly on a pile of bones. Since jaguars are very active in Gran Chaco, I initially thought that the bones must have belonged to a jaguar kill, perhaps a deer or some type of pig. But upon further inspection, I found that they were too large to be a pig of any kind, and too much like a monkey to be a deer. The forests are home to howler monkeys too, so when I saw bones that looked remarkably like those of a human hand, I thought they belonged to some dead monkey. But then I saw the skull, and there was no mistaking things anymore. I had landed on a human skeleton, one that was filthy and moss-eaten, and when I realized that, a powerful feeling of mortal dread came over me. I picked myself up and crossed myself before brushing myself off. Unfortunately, that wasn't the first time that I'd found a human body hidden among the wilds of Gran Chaco. But it was the first that I'd found spontaneously, as in not on a search, and the first that I'd found in such a terrible state of decomposition. I carefully flattened some of the grass around it and then walked around it in a circle, studying it as I went. It looked like it had been there a long time, like the ground was already in the process of swallowing it up with dirt and grass. But then as I walked, I stood on something else that felt hard under my boot, and on closer inspection, I found a second skeleton just feet away from the first. It's hard to describe the feeling of abject terror one feels upon viewing human remains, unless you yourself have experienced the same sensation. But to see two sets of human remains in such quick succession, it made me fear for my life. It made me wonder what had happened there for two people to lose their lives on almost the same spot, and the dread that I felt was only amplified when I found the third skeleton, and then the fourth, and then the fifth. I came to realize that there were human remains for 100 meters in every direction, and every couple of meters I saw the eyeless sockets of a skull as they stared back at me from the undergrowth. And this was no ancient indigenous burial site either, as some of the remains came complete with half-rotted boots or sneakers lying close by. The place was a cemetery without graves, and I feared that whatever fate had befallen these poor souls would soon befall me. I left that place as quickly but carefully as I could, not wanting to disturb any more sets of human remains, and then drove straight back to the place my group was headquartered in Puerto Esperanza. When I told our station chief what I'd seen, he demanded we drive back out onto Gran Chaco so he could see for himself. He didn't think that I was lying or mistaken, he just simply wished to see such a thing for himself. And when we arrived, he was just as horrified as I was, and before we departed, we said a prayer for the dead together, and after that it was out of our hands as the federal police stepped in to carry out their investigation. They are Argentina's equivalent of the FBI, and in coordination with our group from the National Parks Administration, they were able to paint a picture of what had happened to the many lost souls that we found. From around 10 years in the 70s and 80s, the Argentine government collaborated with several other South American countries for what was called Operation Condor. Condor was the code name given to the tactics of anti-communist repression that these countries employed. And then, along with jailing activists and assassinating politicians, the Argentine security services began what came to be known as Los Vuelos de la Muerta, or in English, the death flights. And this is when they would load a dozen prisoners onto an airplane or helicopter, fly them out into the middle of nowhere, and then throw them out of the aircraft to disappear them. Thousands of people were murdered this way, and to this day, many of their bodies have never been recovered. But as much as I am proud to have helped return many lost souls to their rightful resting places, there are still many more who remain missing. And although I am happy to have helped reunite these poor people with their long, grieving families, I'm haunted by the sight of what became of them. And some nights, I dream that I too am being thrown to my death from the hold of an airplane. I used to be a surveyor for a large oil and gas company that will hereby remain unnamed. I think I'll also remain unnamed because the specifics of what I did for a living tend to make certain people very, very angry. See, I used to scour this great nation of ours looking for areas of outstanding natural beauty and assess their potential to be, in the words of one critic, pillaged and polluted so fat cat corporate types can make a buck. I guess that's not entirely wrong. Oil and gas have made a lot of people a lot of money, but modern oil and gas extraction is a lot less messy than it used to be, so it's not like the places I recommend end up scorched, scarred, and devoid of all life. The primary reason I took the job is because I love being outdoors, and being a surveyor afforded me a heck of a lot of time in the field. The last thing I wanted is to see the environment ruined, but as a society, I knew we couldn't just switch to renewables overnight. So I decided to live my dream of making a low six figures for being what was essentially a professional hiker and see if I couldn't do some good from the inside. But just because I was living my dream doesn't mean it was always smooth sailing. There was this one job that I took back when I first qualified as a surveyor, my third ever trip into the boonies that took me to the middle of nowhere, Arizona. I had to drive around 9 miles off-road, then hike another 4 or 5 just to get to my destination. Then once I'd taken my geophone readings, I turned around and then started making my way back to my truck. It was early fall, but those Arizona daytime temperatures were unforgiving. Not quite as unforgiving as the summertime, but it still made for a sweaty hike, and I had to stop about half a dozen times just to drink some water and let some sweat dry. I hadn't seen another living soul out there all day, but when I was on my third stop, only a couple of miles from where my truck was, I saw a lone hiker wandering down the trail. He looked to be about the same age as me, maybe a little younger, and he had this sort of California hippie look about him. He had shoulder-length long hair, loose-fitting shorts, and a shirt with some kind of Native American design on it, and then hiking shoes that looked like they'd seen better days. When he saw me, he smiled this big, friendly smile and said something like, "All right, Didn't expect to see a fellow traveler out in the trails today. Surveying could be a really lonely job, so I didn't mind the company. And then after he sat down opposite me on a rock, we got to talking about the trails and the area in general. It's not often I got company while I was working, so it was nice to be able to talk shop with someone. But then I guess I must have said something about work because the guy suddenly asked me if I was a ranger. It didn't even occur to me that I should bend the truth a little, so I told him, no, I wasn't a ranger. I was an oil and gas surveyor. He kind of frowned a little, then asked what the job entailed, and when I told him, I included all the necessary caveats about how it's all responsible regenerative practices that don't leave places polluted or scarred. And the guy just sat there, listening to me speak. He kept that same chill facial expression, nodded along every so often, and even seemed to agree with some of the stuff I was saying. He asked me a few questions about pay and benefits and all that stuff, and at first I got the impression that he was interested in becoming a surveyor himself. But then after the conversation meandered elsewhere and started to peter out a little, this hippie-looking guy suddenly turned to me and said, "I got a question about that whole surveying thing." I told him to fire away, and then with that same chill smile on his face he said, "I can't help but wonder, how the F do you sleep at night?" And the question was so unexpected, and the tone he used to ask it was still so friendly sounding, that I honestly figured that I misheard him. Then when I repeated the question back to him to confirm it's what he'd said, he just nodded like it was the most normal thing in the world to ask of someone. I told him I slept just fine, that I worked for an energy company, not some evil megacorp who sells missiles or sketchy pharmaceuticals to third world countries. I still know, that energy companies can be incredibly greedy, but my job was all about efficiency. If I did it properly, it would lead to less speculation, less drilling, and less destruction to the environment. But as much as I thought that I'd made that abundantly clear to my new hiking buddy, he obviously chose not to believe it. I remember he said, "Let me get this straight. You love the outdoors, but you're helping destroy it. And you don't lose any sleep over it? I'll take bullcrap for 200, Alex." I realized I'd lost the guy completely. That's if I ever really had him to begin with. I told him if he had a problem with what I did, that was his business, not mine. But if he really felt that way, it was probably best if we just changed the subject or just didn't hike together. I thought he'd want to get away from me since he was so disgusted by what I did. But he didn't. He stayed put and just kept on asking me how I was able to live with myself knowing that I was contributing to the entire planet's destruction. And I was rapidly losing patience, so I decided the best thing to do was to walk in the opposite direction that we were headed for a while. It meant adding time to my own hike, but by that point, I didn't care. I wanted this guy away from me, but he seemed perfectly content to follow me up the trail while continuing to casually insult me. Eventually, I lost my temper completely and told him I either walked away or things were going to get physical. The guy raised his hands as if to say, "No need for fisticuffs," and then said, "All right, man, you got it. I can see I got under your skin a little, but I'll be on my way." Then off he went, walking on down the trail until he was out of sight, while I sat on a rock trying to breathe my anger away. And I gave it around 10 to 15, enough time that we wouldn't run into each other again, and then I hit the trail. But I don't think that I made it more than a mile before I heard, "Hey, scumbag," from off the trail to my side, and I looked around to see that hippie guy walking out of the woods, holding a pistol in his hand. Now this was my turn to raise my hands as if to show that I didn't want the conflict, but the guy wasn't interested in anything I had to say anymore, and he kept the gun trained on me as he stepped out onto the trail. He then says, "Not so tough now, huh?" and then told me to get on my knees. When I told him I wouldn't do that, he put the gun right up against my head and told me I could either do as he said, or he'd kill me right there and then. I honestly figured he was going to kill me no matter what I did, and if I was going to die, I wanted to go out with some dignity. I certainly wasn't some ninja who could karate chop the gun out of his hand before he pulled the trigger, but I also didn't want to give him the satisfaction of dropping to my knees and pleading for my life. I actually tried to say that too, but when I tried to speak, no words would come out. It felt like no matter what I did, no matter what I said, he was going to pull that trigger and everything would just cut to black. So instead of doing anything, I guess I just sort of shut down. And when I started to shake, he made fun of me for being scared, and then goes into some big speech about how what he was doing, putting a gun to my head, was essentially what I was doing to the entirety of planet Earth. He couldn't understand how I was able to sleep at night, but he figured that he'd sleep like a goddamn baby if he blew my brains out, because it only meant one less parasite to suck the life of Earth. I'm not going to make out like I wasn't terrified. I was more frightened out there than I've ever been in my entire life. But he was saying all this stuff I'd heard 100 times before, so there was this kind of surreal moment where I found myself thinking, I can't believe this crap is the last thing I'll ever hear. The only time I found myself close to tears or showing any kind of emotion that wasn't hate and anger was when I thought about my mom and how she'd wondered what happened to me if search and rescue didn't actually find my body. Thankfully, I didn't have to dwell on that long, because before those thoughts managed to break me down completely, the guy pulled the trigger. It didn't shoot me. He moved the gun to the side at the last second and then fired a shot off right next to my ear. I didn't actually realize that I had been shot, though. It's almost like the explosion in my left ear and deafness that followed made me think that I'd actually been shot in the head. So I just sort of collapsed to the ground, clutching the side of my head, and the last thing I kind of heard in my good ear before the guy eventually disappeared was the muffled sound of, "Quit your job, asshole." I honestly thought that I was a dead man, because the shot had caused blood to come out of my ear and my whole head was just completely throbbing. So I thought that I'd been hit, and I had maybe seconds to live before I collapsed and bled out from a shot to the head. But after lying there, waiting for everything to fade, I slowly realized that I was okay, or at least that I wasn't going to die. I managed to make it back to my truck, drove to a hospital to get my ear checked out, and then filed a police report as soon as I was able to. It took a while for my hearing to partially come back, as it's still not entirely back, and the cops didn't manage to catch up with the guy who'd almost deafened me. I didn't think that they would. I didn't even catch the guy's name, but it still makes me mad sometimes thinking that he just got away with that, scot-free. I did end up quitting my surveyor's job too. The social pressure just got too much, and I couldn't face lying about what I do for a living for the rest of my life. Now, I won't bore you with what I had to do now, but let's just say it's nothing a person might threaten to kill you over because it's on the wrong side of their politics. After earning my pilot's license, I managed to land myself a pretty cushy job flying for a major airline. The pay was fantastic, the hours weren't too bad, and my girlfriend thought that I looked great in my fitted uniform and aviator shades. People thought I was having the time of my life, but the truth was, I hated it. I hated the structure, how polished but ultimately phony everything about the airline was, and I hated paying a ton of money to rent a home I barely visited. So one day, I just shocked everyone by just quitting. I didn't just quit with nothing lined up. I'd found another job before I handed in my 3 months' notice. It's just that the new job happened to involve moving up to Alaska to be a bush pilot. My girlfriend thought I was crazy, and we broke up not long after a big fight. And then about a month later, and after selling off or giving away like half of the stuff I owned, I flew up to Alaska and out to the little airfield that I'd be working from. I stayed in a cabin just a short walk from the airfield, a place so run down when I moved in that first night it had me wondering if I'd actually made a mistake. But then after a trip over to the Fairbanks to pick up some groceries and home improvements, the cabin started to feel a little more like home, and I remembered why the whole thing seemed like a good idea in the first place. It was peaceful. I got to set my own schedule, and some of my passengers ended up being some incredibly interesting people. There was something about living wild that felt good for my soul, too, but don't worry, I'm not about to get all poetic on you. Life was good, but that didn't mean that there wasn't a little turbulence here and there. I had trouble in the air on more than one occasion. I had encounters with wildlife that looked at me like I was dinner, and I saw one or two things from the air that I'd never be able to fully explain, and this is the story of just one of them. One day, I was making a pretty routine flight, taxiing a couple of researchers from A to B. I'd been in the air for a couple of hours already, flying under superb weather conditions for the spring, when something down below suddenly caught my eye. The ground beneath was a carpet of trees, but every so often there'd be a little clearing, some large, some smaller. Save for the occasional rogue tree, most were completely bare, but the one I spotted that morning had a row of what looked like saplings, all standing in a row. It struck me as an odd sight among all that wilderness, and since there are few straight lines in nature, I knew that there was a good chance it was man-made. But as I got closer and ended up passing the clearing with it on my left, I looked out the window and saw they weren't saplings, but crosses. I banked left, turning so I could pass the clearing a second time at a lower altitude. You don't see a lot of stuff like that out in the middle of nowhere, so I guess curiosity got the better of me and I wanted to check it out. Coming up on the clearing again, I could see that they were crosses all right, big ones too. But it was only when I flew directly over that I saw something squirming against the wood, something that was almost camouflaged from a distance, and I could only see up close. There were people attached to those crosses, some still, some writhing around in what I could only imagine was absolute agony. I didn't take another pass. I got myself back on course and hit my radio to see if anyone was within range. The only person I could raise was a logging camp, but I asked them to get in touch with the WSAR, the Wilderness Search and Rescue, on my behalf. When the guy asked what he should say, I couldn't bring myself to tell him exactly what I'd seen. I knew he'd think I was crazy, so I made something up about spotting some campers who looked like they were in trouble. The guy at the logging camp said he'd get on the horn to search and rescue, and then after I thanked him, I left to make the rest of the flight with nothing but my thoughts and theories to keep me company. I didn't mention anything to the researchers, and their company was actually a huge relief as it kept my mind off what I'd just seen. But on that last leg of the flight, when I was all on my own again, I started thinking all that solitude and isolation might be getting the best of me. I radioed my boss on the long-range radio that I had in my cabin, and I told him about what I'd seen, or rather, what I thought I might have seen out there in the wilderness. He told me to fly back to Fairbanks to take a week off, and when I did, we met up for some dinner at a little steak and taters place that he liked. And he said the human contact would do me some good, and he was right. It was great to be able to talk to someone about the job and about life too, and it not be via the medium of some ham radio. But he also told me something I never forgot. He said he found it funny how some people think of Florida as the weirdest state in the Union, and maybe out of the lower 48 it is. But of all the places he'd ever lived, it was the state of Alaska that took the cake for sheer weirdness. It wasn't just all the people that had gone missing over the years either. It was the people who hadn't, which made the wilderness such an odd place. People who moved up there to get away from things. People just like me, I guess, and for the most part, all they wanted was to be left alone so they could live how they wanted to. Like I said, I saw a whole bunch of other weird stuff during flights, but nothing that ever stuck with me as long as those crosses did. I hope it was part of some passion play type of thing, and those people were just up there on their own free will and lived to tell the tale. Because the alternative, thinking they were put up there to die, it's almost too horrible to even think about. In the summer of 2015, so more than a decade ago now, me and a few friends were just sinking beers and watching TV in my apartment when I flicked over to the History Channel and saw this show called Alone. Now, for folks who have never seen it, a bunch of contestants get dropped off in some isolated patch of forest up in Canada, but so spaced out that they can't work together, and hence why the title is called Alone. They only get the basic survival equipment, and contestants can tap out at any time, and then whoever stays out there longest wins $1 million. And as we're watching, an argument breaks out between us over which one of us would win the $1 million, and by the end of the night, we only agreed on one thing. We should head out to the middle of nowhere for some kind of hardcore camping trip and find out which one of us was king of the wilderness. And then a few months later, the 5 of us are sitting in a truck headed for a place known as the River of No Return. Now, its full name is the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, but we ended up shortening it to the much more ominous River of No Return to make the trip sound more badass. It's the largest wilderness area of Alaska, and with us living in Boise, it was basically right up there on our doorstep. We drove up to a little town called North Fork and then made our way to the trailhead, which would take us to a place called Long Tom Mountain on foot. And this meant our 4 days hiking there and back and 1 day's rest on Long Tom Mountain, with some fishing and swimming in the nearby Salmon River while we camped there. That first day's hike was rough, and I slept like the dead when we finally made camp for the night. The second day was a little easier after the first, and seeing the view from the top of that mountain made every second of that hike feel worth it. We made camp again, grabbed our towels, and then headed down the mountain for that fishing and swimming I told you about, which was probably the most fun I'd had in a long while. It just felt epic, for lack of a better words, you know? Like we were making memories. Especially when our buddy Dave caught a couple of fish with a collapsible pole that he brought along with him. They weren't huge, but knowing we were about to eat something we'd actually caught made the whole thing feel extra special. With a few hours of daylight left, we headed back up the mountain feeling refreshed, and then got to work making a fire so we could get those fish cooked. The first thing our buddy Kyle does when he gets back to the camp is crawl into his tent for something. But then he comes back out a second later and says very sarcastically, "Ha ha, very funny," and then asks which of us took his backpack. Now we respond, "I don't know what you're talking about, dude." But Kyle tells us to cut the crap and return his backpack before he starts getting mad. Now again, the 4 of us tell him that we have zero clue what he's talking about, and that if we're going to prank him, we'd think of something funnier than just hiding his stuff. Kyle kind of stops, but he doesn't calm down. Then after a little more discussion, we collectively come to a pretty creepy conclusion. Somebody had been walking around our camp while we were down by the river, and they'd chosen to steal Kyle's backpack along with everything he was holding. We were definitely creeped out because who was this thief, and had they been following us? Were they dangerous? But I'd also say that the primary thing we were feeling at the time, especially Kyle, was anger. All he had left was his phone, his gun, and his tent, along with a handful of other items that hadn't been inside his bag. What he'd lost amounted to hundreds of dollars worth of clothes and hiking equipment, so as I said, he was majorly pissed. After pacing back and forth in anger for a while, wondering why me out loud, and rightfully so, something kind of flipped in Kyle and he suddenly says, "I'm gonna go look for him." Meaning the person who stole his stuff. But this split the group almost right down the middle. Kyle and another guy, Jay, wanted to go hunt the thieves down, but me, Dave, and our other friend, Sherrod, thought that was a terrible idea. We were mad about the theft too, but the solution was not to turn our epic hiking vacation into an effing manhunt. Dave suggested we relocate our camp before bedding down for the night, but Kyle outright refused, and we couldn't talk him down on the manhunt thing either. It got kind of heated at one point, with Kyle calling us a bunch of pansies, and then he and Jay just storm off to go looking for those thieves. Now, I remember Dave saying, "It's okay, they won't find anyone, and by the time he comes back, he'll have just calmed down a little." And he was right. Kyle came back maybe a half hour later, much calmer but majorly bummed out. But I can't blame him, we all were. We knew our epic survival trip had basically been ruined by some creepy a-hole with sticky fingers. The whole point was to get away from people, so knowing we weren't as alone as we thought we were sucked balls. And the next morning marked the beginning of the 3rd day, the one that we were supposed to spend relaxing by that river, getting ready for the hike back. We tried to make the best of things, but instead of getting to completely chill and enjoy having all that wilderness to ourselves, we couldn't even leave our damned camp alone. Dave said that he didn't want to do any more fishing, especially if it meant being alone down there by the river. He also said that we should probably gather a bunch more firewood to keep the campfire burning throughout the night. If we weren't going to move camp, it was probably a good idea that we take turns keeping watch throughout the night. And I asked if he thought the situation was bad enough that we needed to post a freaking sentry like we were at war or something. He said he didn't like how quiet it was when we went out to gather firewood, that the thief might still be out there and it was better to be safe than sorry. That's when it really hit me how much trouble we were in. Dave wasn't a nervous person, and since he used to go fishing a whole bunch with his dad, he was easily the most experienced of the five of us when it came to being out of doors. So to have him say something like that, it just kind of hit different. We each had a pistol with us, so it wasn't like we felt completely defenseless or anything, but that night, as we all stayed up late in the night shining flashlights out into the darkness, it was definitely the most creeped out that I'd felt in a long, long time. And it was only made worse by the fact that Kyle actually wanted a confrontation. We each got a couple of hours of sleep, taking turns, keeping watches, agreed to, and then come sunrise, once everyone was on their feet, we agreed to get back on the trails as soon as possible. We still had one more night to spend in that river of no return, and seeing as the situation hadn't taken a turn for the worse, we thought it would probably be best to make camp early so we could just rest before having another all-nighter. And the hike that final camp was very tiring but uneventful. We were still mad, Kyle especially, but after we set up camp in the late afternoon, the mood seemed to just lighten a little. We all agreed that whoever stole from us was probably long gone with Kyle's stuff, and that the chances of seeing them again were probably non-existent. But on that count, we were proven majorly wrong. Maybe an hour or two before sunset, our friend Sherrod walked off to take a dump. He took his gun along with him because there was still that thought of, we're not alone out here in the back of our minds. But we never imagined there'd be an issue with him walking off to take a bathroom break. Not till a couple of minutes after he walked off, when we suddenly heard him scream. And I say scream, it was more like he yelled a curse at the top of his lungs, which had all of us running in his direction. And he met us halfway, looking scared out of his mind, and told us that he'd just seen someone watching him through the trees. Sherrod said that for privacy, he walked till he couldn't see us anymore, and then before dropping his pants, he looked around in all directions to make sure the coast was clear, and that's when he spotted him. Sherrod said that the guy was almost a full football field away, just some sort of figure in the distance, but he was easy to spot because his whole face seemed to be painted bright white. He said he didn't stop to see what he was wearing or if he was holding anything. He just sort of bolted the second he saw him. But we all agreed that was probably who'd stolen Kyle's backpack. I thought Kyle was about to go ripping off through the woods to find that guy, but I guess hearing about the bright white face knocked some of the pep out of him. And it took some of the pep out of me too, especially once we all asked Sherrod if he was sure about the whole white painted face thing or if he was messing with us. Sherrod said in his exact words, "On my mama, bro, mother effer looked like the crow ran out of black." And as we headed back to camp, Kyle said that he thought the person who stole from us was like some trail rat or something, some scumbag solo hiker who smelled how green we were and took what he wanted when we inevitably left our camp unattended. But to think that he was out there putting white makeup on before stalking us through the woods for probably miles, that majorly changed the game for everyone. Like I said, we were armed, but we didn't know to what extent our pale-faced friend was armed either. We also didn't know whether or not he was alone or if there was a whole bunch of freaks with painted faces out there and we just spotted one of them. And that's when we decided a change of schedule. Instead of just sitting there all night with our campfire lighting up like a damn beacon, we decided to walk all the way through the night so we could reach the trailhead and Dave's truck by morning. We packed up our camp again with daylight fading pretty fast, and then after maybe a half an hour or so, it was full on dark and we were walking by flashlight. To say we were on edge would be the understatement of the century, and Dave later said that he was more scared of us accidentally shooting each other than anything our pale-faced follower might have in store for us. Everyone was doing these little 360s every so often, making sure that there was no one shadowing us, and just the thought of my flashlight catching that pale face through the trees was giving me shivers as we walked. And we walked for hours like that too, most of the time in total silence, until suddenly it was broken by our friend Jay saying in this quiet but freaked out voice, "Dude, what the F?" He was standing dead still, and so was the beam of his flashlight as he pointed at something hanging from a nearby tree. It was Kyle's backpack, the straps hanging from 2 branches that looked like they'd been cut short. But the thing that really caught our attention was how it had been shot, full of arrows. Now we gathered around it, our flashlights all converging on that one spot, and no one spoke for a while till I distinctly remember Sherrod saying, "This can't be happening right now." Kyle reached up to take his bag down, and Jay said something about preserving evidence for the cops or whatever, and then when Sherrod was like, "What are the cops gonna do?" I remember agreeing with him. Whoever was following us, you only saw him when he wanted you to see him, or at least that's how it felt. And the cops weren't going to mount some Bin Laden-style hunt for this paleface when all he did was ruin a backpack. Kyle ended up taking one of the arrows to the cops, thinking that the numbers and letters on it were some kind of serial number, but they turned out to be spec numbers, denoting nothing but the model of the arrow. On top of that, the kind he brought in were some of the most commonly sold sporting good arrows in America, so they literally could have come from anywhere. We didn't see anything else on the way back to the trailhead, but we didn't need to. We were done pretending we were on the same level as that guy, whoever he was, because if it had come to some kind of confrontation like Kyle initially wanted, I have a pretty good feeling it was us that would have come off worse. I thought the ride back might be a quiet one, but it wasn't, and the whole way we just talked about what happened. I guess we all kind of have different takes on it, especially when it came to how dangerous the guy actually was, and what would have happened if he wanted to fight instead of just trying to spook us. But the one thing we agreed on was that, for our next trip, we were staying the hell away from the River of No Return. So almost 15 years ago now, before my husband and I settled down and started a family, I went on a horse drive up in Montana. I'd always been something of a horse girl growing up, so it had always been a dream of mine to do something like that. So in the spring of 2009, I booked a guest spot on a cattle drive organized by a ranch up in southern Montana. I flew out to Billings and was picked up at the airport with several other guest riders. Some of them come from as far away as Europe, and since the drive out to the ranch was just over 2 hours, we had plenty of time to get to know each other on the way. The ranch cook fed us dinner when we arrived, and as we ate, our guide explained what we'd be doing for the next 5 days. We'd head out on a few warm-up rides to get us used to working as a team, and then we'd talk to some of the wranglers about what it's like to live out there and do the job they do. And then finally, we'd use the wrangling skills we'd learned to drive a herd of 150 horses south of the border to their summer home in Wyoming. It was said to be the complete cowboy experience, and to me, it sounded like heaven on earth. But if the beginning was heaven, then the end might as well have been hell. After that first night on the ranch, we woke up super early for breakfast and then went down to the stables to meet our horses for the week. Mine was a caramel-colored Mustang named Chip. She had a black mane and ermine spots, so combined with her coat, she had the color of a chocolate chip cookie, hence the name. I loved riding Chip, and she was an incredible animal. Calm and disciplined, but full of energy too. And then since we were all pretty experienced riders, it wasn't long before we were riding into the heart of the Montana wilderness. As we rode out, I felt like I was back on the wild frontier, more like 100 years before, and the feeling of freedom was nothing short of exhilarating. Then once we were done, we rode back towards the ranch at a much faster pace before spending the night there. The next morning we were back in the saddle, headed north towards the plains. We were looking for a herd of horses roaming north of the ranch, but when we started out, we couldn't even see them. We had to ride for an hour across almost featureless plains before they finally came into view, and when they did, it was probably one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. More than 150 Pryor Mountain Mustangs were spread out across the horizon, with coats ranging from bay to red to palomino. They were the descendants of Spanish horses that escaped New Mexico in the 1600s, a piece of living history right there in front of me, and it was our job to wrangle them back towards the ranch. But that first drive was probably the hardest ride of my whole life. The wranglers didn't mess around. They talked to us like they would each other, which for an adopted city girl like me was not something I was used to. Every other word was a curse word. They rode like they were mad at the herd, and if you slipped out of position and you didn't do what you needed to do, boy, they let you know about it. When the ranch finally came into view, we stopped for some lunch and to talk about how we did. We drove the horses some more in the afternoon, then as the sun started to set, we rode back to the ranch to get some well-deserved dinner. I remember the wranglers telling us to get as much rest as possible because not only did we have a wake-up call at 4:30 a.m. the next morning, but the next few nights would be spent on bedrolls out in the plains. I didn't get to sleep till around 10 on account of how excited I was, so I was groggy as hell when I woke up. But after a cup of cowboy coffee and a few pancakes, I was ready to hit the saddle again. We found the herd and then started pushing them through the ranch in a kind of semicircle. The odd colt tried to break from the herd every so often, and I was just giddy at the prospect of getting to canter one back towards the herd. When the time came, it felt every bit as good as I thought it would, and then we kept driving all day long till it came time to camp. We set up a high line for the horses, basically a kind of clothesline that you can tie them to, and then set up our tents in a rough circle around the spot that we built our campfire. We ate some basic campfire food, talked about the day's ride, and then as night began to fall, people headed for their tents as the day's exhaustion began to set in. I was exhausted too, but I couldn't sleep. Looking up at the night sky, hearing the horses snorting behind us and the fire crackling in front of us, I just didn't want it to end. So I stayed up with one of the wranglers who also couldn't sleep. I can remember exactly what we were talking about, flavors of beef jerky, when something flew over my head and landed a few feet short from the campfire. I screamed, which woke people up and brought them from their tents. Then as we crowded round to see what it was, I remember how this chill came over the camp. It was the back half of a jackrabbit, torn clean through the middle. A bloody set of legs and tail lying near the campfire. One of the wranglers said that it might have been a bird of some kind having accidentally dropped its nighttime meal while flying over the camp. But me and that night owl wrangler knew otherwise. It came in at an arc, not like it had fallen. It's almost like it had been thrown. The wranglers told us to stay put, then immediately fanned out on horseback to make sure the area was clear. They returned without having seen anything, and they had to do their best to calm us down by saying it was someone just trying to scare us. The town of Fort Smith wasn't all that far away, so it was possible some jerk-off hunter just wanted to spook the tourists for kicks. But no matter the reason, our next camp would be 20 miles south, and since the wranglers carried personal protection, we had little to nothing to worry about. And that seemed to put us somewhat at ease. And then we managed to get a couple of hours sleep before getting back in the saddle again come morning. The mood on that morning's ride was much different than the first. It made for a tense atmosphere, but we focused on doing our jobs, and for the first time, we actually managed to impress a couple of them. We rode all morning, crossed the river in the afternoon, and then finished the day almost 22 miles from where we started. Over dinner, that German guy with us asked one of the riders if he thought that we'd find the other half of that rabbit that night. He actually laughed at the question, and the German guy joined him, because while it was technically possible to have tracked and followed us, as we were driving 150 horses after all, it was unlikely anyone was that dedicated to harassing us. Unlikely, but not impossible, as we soon discovered. And aside from one of the wranglers who was keeping watch, we were all asleep in our tents when we heard the horses suddenly start to make a lot of noise. I remember sitting up in time to hear the watchman yell, "Who's out there?" And then as I was climbing out of my tent to see what was happening, the horses started getting even louder, like something was out there spooking them. One of the wranglers came out of his tent, but before he can turn his flashlight on them to see what all the ruckus is about, we heard the sound of galloping hooves. Then as the light hits them, we watch in absolute horror as our group of 18 horses come bolting right towards camp. Some of the wranglers ran to try and shoo them off, but it was too late, and one of them got knocked to the ground pretty bad by a stampeding stallion. But that was nowhere near the worst of it. Some of my fellow guest riders got smashed aside as they came out of their tents, then got trampled as they lay there stunned and defenseless. Others were hit by the metal loops and the ropes we used to secure the horses, and at the speed the horses were running, the impacts were enough to cause deep, bloody gashes on those unlucky enough to receive them. It was chaos, pure and horrible chaos. One wrangler jumped out of the way of one horse, and then stood up just in time to get hit by another. And then I saw two guests get knocked into one another before getting trampled. The horse that hit them didn't even stumble. Nothing could stop those horses. No tents, no campfire, not us. Nothing. And seeing as those gentle beasts suddenly were so mad that they'd become a danger to us, it was a reminder of how terrifying nature can be, even what we'd considered the cuddlier sides. When it was over and the last horse disappeared into the dark, all you could hear were the groans of the people who were hurt. I'd managed to avoid the worst of it, but my tent and all my stuff had been completely trampled. Yet none of that mattered in the moment. All that mattered was seeing to the people that had been hurt. I remember the German guy, Jürgen, the one that had asked about the other half of the rabbit. He'd been trampled after getting knocked down, and by the looks of things, he had a bunch of broken ribs and a few of his teeth had been knocked out. There were a couple of broken wrists, a dislocated shoulder, a lot of sprains and a few bumped heads, but Jürgen the German got the worst of it. The others needed medical attention, but Jürgen ended up needing a helicopter to get him out of there safely. The rest of us waited for a bunch of 4x4s to show up and give us a ride back to the ranch, where those with less serious injuries were then driven to the nearest hospital. I couldn't believe that I got to walk away without getting hurt. I wasn't the only one, but I thank God that I wasn't one of the poor folks who got caught in the center of that stampede. The last 2 days on the ranch were spent either riding or helping with livestock, and they offered everyone either a full refund or an open invitation to return to take part in another horse drive completely free of charge. I took the second offer, hoping that I'd get to go back one day, and all those years later, I'm still waiting for that opportunity to come. But this time, when I go back to Montana, I'm not going with the naive notion that it's some storybook cowboy paradise. It's a wild place, a place some people call home, and some of those people do not like outsiders. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. Go check it out. All the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, get a prenup.